The meeting that changed everything. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Highway 341, creating shimmering waves of heat that danced above the asphalt like ghosts of summer past. Alan Jackson adjusted his baseball cap and squinted through the windshield of his pickup truck, the familiar weight of exhaustion settling into his shoulders after another long night in the studio. At 54, the country music legend had seen enough sunrises and sunsets to last several lifetimes, but something about this particular August morning felt different. He'd been driving back from his recording session in Macon when he spotted the commotion ahead. A cluster of vehicles lined the roadside, and a small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a farm entrance. Alan's first instinct was to drive past. He'd learned long ago that stopping at every roadside incident could turn a simple trip home into an all-day affair. But as he drew closer, something made him slow down. An elderly man sat on the tailgate of a battered Ford pickup, his weathered hands covering his face. Even from a distance, Alan could see the man's shoulders shaking. A woman, presumably his wife, stood beside him with her hand on his back, her own face etched with a mixture of grief and anger. Around them, several other people milled about, some holding papers, others gesturing animatedly toward a "for sale" sign that had been hastily planted in the red Georgia clay. Against his better judgment, Alan pulled over. The gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the group, keeping his distance initially. He recognized the look on these faces. He'd seen it before in his own family, in the stories his father had told him about the Great Depression, in the eyes of countless fans who'd shared their struggles with him over the years. "Excuse me," Alan said quietly, addressing a middle-aged man in overalls who stood at the edge of the group. "What's happening here?" The man turned, and Alan saw the instant recognition flash across his face. But instead of the usual excitement or requests for autographs, the man's expression remained somber. "Mr. Jackson," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's Tom Henderson. Bank just foreclosed on his farm, been in his family for 3 generations. Alan felt his stomach drop. He looked past the man to the elderly farmer on the tailgate, then to the vast expanse of farmland stretching beyond the fence. The corn was tall and green, clearly well tended. This wasn't the property of someone who'd given up. This was the land of someone who'd fought until the very end. "How much land?" Alan asked. 240 acres. Tom's daddy bought it back in 52. And Tom's been working it ever since. Lost his oldest boy in Iraq 3 years back, and his younger son moved to Atlanta for work. Tom's been trying to manage it all himself, but with the drought 2 years ago and then the flooding last spring." The man trailed off, shaking his head. Alan nodded slowly. He knew the story well. It was playing out across rural America like a broken record, small family farms being swallowed up by corporate agriculture or lost to economic pressures that seemed to multiply with each passing year. It was a story he'd grown up with, one that had shaped not just his music, but his understanding of what America really meant to people like Tom Henderson. "Mind if I go talk to him?" Alan asked. The man shrugged. "Free country. Though I don't reckon Tom's much in the mood for conversation right about now." Alan walked slowly toward the elderly couple, removing his cap as he approached. The woman, Tom's wife he assumed, looked up first. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was steel in them too. This was a woman who'd weathered many storms. "Ma'am," Alan said, nodding respectfully. "Sir, I'm Alan Jackson. I couldn't help but notice what was happening here." Tom Henderson looked up, his face streaked with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. He was probably in his 70s, with hands that told the story of a lifetime of honest work. His eyes, pale blue and watery, focused on Alan with effort. "I know who you are, son," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "My wife Martha here. She's got all your records. Used to play 'em while she cooked Sunday dinner." He paused, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Guess there won't be many more Sunday dinners in that old kitchen. Martha Henderson stepped forward, extending her hand. Mr. Jackson, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Tom and we're big fans. Your music, it's always reminded us of home, you know? Alan shook her hand gently, noting the calluses and the simple gold wedding band that had probably been there for 50 years or more. The pleasure's mine, Mrs. Henderson. And please, call me Alan. He turned to Tom. Mr. Henderson, if you don't mind me asking, what happened here? Tom's face crumpled slightly, but he steadied himself. Same old story, I reckon. Started with the drought in 2021. Lost about 40% of my crop that year. Then last spring we got so much rain so fast, lost another 30% to flooding. Insurance covered some of it, but not near enough. Bank's been patient, I'll give 'em that, but patience runs out eventually. How much do they want? Alan asked quietly. Tom and Martha exchanged a look. The full amount? 230,000. Been chipping away at it for 20 years, but these last couple years... He shook his head. Might as well be 2 million for all the good it does us. Alan felt something shift inside his chest. $230,000. For most people, it might as well be a fortune. For Alan Jackson, it was less than he'd made from his last 3 concerts. The thought hit him like a physical blow, not the money itself, but the stark inequality of it. Here was a man who'd worked every day of his life, who'd raised children and contributed to his community, whose son had died serving his country, and he was losing everything over an amount that some people spent on cars. Mr. Henderson, Alan said carefully, when do you have to be out? End of the week, Martha answered when her husband couldn't. 67 years we've lived on this land. Raised 3 children here, buried 1. Tom's daddy is buried up on that hill yonder. She pointed toward a small fenced area visible in the distance. Don't know what we're going to do with his grave. Alan looked around at the assembled crowd. Most were neighbors, he realized, people who'd come to offer support or to witness the end of an era. There was something profoundly American about the scene. The community gathering, the shared grief, the helpless anger at forces beyond their control. The bank, Alan said. Are they here today? Representative was here earlier, Tom replied. Nice enough fellow, I suppose. Just doing his job. Said they'd give us till Friday to get our personal effects out, and then they'd start proceedings to sell the land. To who? Some development company out of Atlanta gonna turn it into a subdivision, near as I can tell. Call it something like Henderson Estates, or some such nonsense. Tom's voice carried a bitter edge. Least they're keeping the name, I suppose. Alan felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The attention was gratifying, but it was also threatening to overshadow what this was really about. He looked around at the organized chaos, camera crews, agriculture officials, reporters with notepads, and in the middle of it all, Tom Henderson, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Martha, tell the reporter from Nashville that we'll talk after the TV interview. And ask the Agriculture Department fellow to wait with him. This is about Tom and the farm first, everything else second. The Good Morning America producer, an energetic woman in her 30s named Sarah Chen, approached the group with a headset around her neck and a tablet in her hand. Mr. Jackson, Mr. Henderson, we're ready for you. This is going to be a feel-good piece to close out the show, so we want to keep it light and inspirational. Mr. Henderson, we'll start with you explaining what was happening with the farm, then Mr. Jackson. You'll talk about why you decided to help, and we'll finish with both of you showing us around the new operation. Tom nodded nervously, but Alan stepped forward. Ms. Chen, with respect, this isn't just a feel-good story. This is about a systematic problem in rural America and one possible solution. I think your viewers deserve to understand the full scope of what's happening here. Sarah looked slightly taken aback. Well, yes, of course, but we only have 4 minutes of airtime. Then let's make sure those 4 minutes count, Alan said firmly. 10 minutes later, they were standing in front of the cameras, with the rolling Georgia farmland stretching out behind them. The interview began as planned, with Tom explaining the financial pressures that had nearly cost him his farm. "It wasn't that I was a bad farmer or a bad businessman," Tom said, his voice steadying as he found his rhythm. "It was just that the math stopped working. Costs kept going up. Seed, fuel, equipment, but what I could get for my crops stayed pretty much the same. And when you have a couple of bad years due to weather, well, there's no safety net for small farmers like there is for some other industries." The interviewer nodded sympathetically. "And Mr. Jackson, what made you decide to get involved?" "Well," Alan said, looking directly into the camera, "I realized that I'd spent my whole career singing about the values that people like Tom represent. Hard work, family, community, taking care of the land. But singing about something and actually supporting it are two different things. Tom Henderson represents the best of rural America, and if we let people like him fail, we're losing something fundamental about who we are as a country. And now you're business partners. That's right, but this isn't charity. Tom's got knowledge and skills that you can't learn in business school. He understands this land, understands farming, understands what it takes to make things grow. I'm providing capital and marketing expertise. Together, we're creating something that honors traditional agriculture while developing new revenue streams that can help family farms survive and thrive." The interviewer turned to Tom. "What's been the most surprising part of this experience?" Tom looked around at the activity surrounding them. Workers finishing the corn maze, volunteers painting signs for the pumpkin patch, Linda Patterson explaining sustainable farming practices to a group of visitors from the Agriculture Department. "I guess it's been realizing that what we thought was just our problem, just the Henderson family's problem, is actually something that a lot of people care about. We've had neighbors, folks from town, even people from Atlanta, all volunteering to help make this work. And Alan here, he didn't just write a check and walk away. He's been here almost every day, working alongside us, learning about farming, teaching us about business. What's next for the Henderson farm?" Alan and Tom exchanged a look, and Tom nodded for Alan to answer. "Next month, we're opening our pumpkin patch and corn maze to the public. But that's just the beginning. We're planning fishing ponds, pick your own vegetables, maybe even some small music events. The goal is to create a place where families from the city can come experience real farm life, while also providing Tom's family with a sustainable income. And I understand there are other farmers interested in similar partnerships." "There are," Linda Patterson called out from behind the camera, before stepping into the shot with the interviewer's permission. "I've been working with rural communities for 20 years, and I've never seen this level of interest in farm diversification. What Alan and Tom have started here could be a model for family farms across the country." After the cameras stopped rolling, the controlled chaos resumed. The Nashville reporter turned out to be interested not just in how the farm partnership might influence Alan's music, but in whether he was planning to invest in other rural development projects. The Agriculture Department official wanted to discuss making the Henderson Farm part of a state-sponsored pilot program for agricultural diversification. But it was a conversation with an unexpected visitor that would prove most significant. While Alan was showing the agriculture official around the property, Tom Henderson approached him with a young woman Alan didn't recognize. "Alan, I'd like you to meet Jessica Martinez. She's a reporter, but not the kind that's been bothering us all week." Jessica was probably in her late 20s, with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. "Mr. Jackson, I'm with Rural Today, a magazine that covers agricultural issues, but I'm actually here because I represent something called the Family Farm Alliance. We're a non-profit organization that helps connect family farms with investors who are interested in sustainable rural development." "What kind of investors?" Alan asked. Well, until this week, mostly small investment groups, some individuals with agricultural backgrounds, a few foundations focused on food security issues. But your partnership with Mr. Henderson has generated enormous interest. We've had calls from celebrity investors, tech entrepreneurs, even some major foundations asking about similar opportunities. Alan felt that familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. What are you proposing? We'd like to facilitate similar partnerships. Use what you've done here as a template, but adapt it to different regions, different types of farms, different crops and livestock operations. The goal would be to preserve family farming while making it economically viable for the next generation. Tom Henderson was listening intently. You mean other folks could do what we're doing here? Exactly. A dairy farm in Wisconsin might partner with someone to develop artisanal cheese-making and farm tours. A cattle ranch in Texas might add hunting leases and guest ranch activities. An apple orchard in Washington might expand into cider making and harvest festivals. The specific activities would vary, but the principle would be the same: preserve the traditional agricultural operation while adding revenue streams that make the farm financially sustainable. Alan looked around at his transformed farm, where workers were putting finishing touches on what would soon be Georgia's newest agritourism destination. Then he looked at Tom Henderson, who 6 weeks ago had been sitting on the tailgate of his truck, crying because he was about to lose everything his family had worked for. "Jessica," Alan said finally, "what would you need from us to make this happen? Honestly? Just your permission to use this as a case study, and maybe your willingness to serve on our advisory board. Your involvement has given this concept a level of visibility and credibility that we never could have achieved on our own." "Tom," Alan looked to his partner. Tom Henderson was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the land that had nearly been lost and was now becoming something entirely new, while remaining fundamentally the same. "Well," Tom said finally, "I reckon if what we're doing here can help other farming families stay on their land, we ought to be willing to share what we've learned." As the sun began to set over the Henderson farm, casting long shadows across the newly planted pumpkin patch and the maze that would soon be filled with families from across Georgia, Alan Jackson realized that what had started as an impulsive act of generosity had evolved into something much larger and more significant. They weren't just saving one farm anymore. They were pioneering a new model for how rural America could adapt and thrive in the 21st century, one partnership at a time. The harvest of hope. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that painted the Georgia countryside in shades of gold and crimson, Alan Jackson stood at the edge of what had once been Tom Henderson's failing farm and was now known throughout the Southeast as Henderson Farms, a country partnership. The transformation was stunning, but more than that, it was successful beyond anyone's most optimistic projections. The parking area, carved out of what used to be unused pasture, was already filling up despite the early hour. Families from Atlanta, Augusta, and even as far away as Jacksonville were arriving for what had become one of Georgia's most popular fall destinations. Children pressed their faces against car windows, eager to see the corn maze that had been featured in Southern Living magazine, while parents consulted the farm map that detailed everything from pumpkin picking to pig petting. Hard to believe, isn't it? Tom Henderson's voice carried a note of wonder as he joined Alan at their unofficial observation spot near the restored farmhouse. At 71, Tom looked younger and more energetic than he had in years. The stress lines that had marked his face during those dark August days had been replaced by the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from work that matters. "Which part?" Alan asked, grinning as he watched a group of kindergartners race toward the pumpkin patch, their teacher hurrying to keep up. The fact that we had 3,000 visitors last weekend, or the fact that the corn maze has been so popular we had to expand it twice. All of it, Tom replied. But mostly the fact that my grandson called yesterday to say he wants to come work the farm next summer, instead of taking that internship in Atlanta. That stopped Alan short. Tom's grandson Michael was 22, fresh out of the University of Georgia with a business degree and a job offer from a major corporation. 6 months ago, the idea of him choosing farm life over corporate success would have been unthinkable. Michael wants to work here, says he's been following what we've been doing, and he thinks there's a real future in this kind of agriculture. Wants to focus on the business side, help us expand the agritourism operation, maybe add some of those farm-to-table dinner events Linda's been talking about. Before Alan could respond, Martha Henderson appeared from the farmhouse, carrying a tray of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that had become her trademark since the farm's transformation began. "Morning, boys," she called out. "Better get your coffee while it's hot. We've got the reporter from CNN coming at 9, and then that documentary crew at 11. The media attention had never completely died down. What had started as a human interest story had evolved into a case study in rural economic development. Harvard Business School had sent researchers to study their partnership model. The USDA was considering incorporating their approach into federal rural development programs. And just last week, they'd learned that their story would be featured in a documentary about innovative approaches to saving family farms. "Martha," Alan said, accepting a steaming mug, "any word from the Family Farm Alliance about those new partnerships?" Her smile widened. "Jessica called yesterday. They've got 17 new partnerships in development across 8 states. A dairy farm in Vermont, that peach orchard in South Carolina, 2 cattle ranches in Texas, and would you believe a cotton farm in Mississippi that wants to add a cotton festival and education center. The success of the Family Farm Alliance had been perhaps the most unexpected outcome of their partnership. What had started as an impulsive decision to help one family had grown into a movement that was reshaping how people thought about rural economic development. Linda Patterson arrived just as the conversation was hitting its stride, carrying her ever-present clipboard and wearing work clothes that were already dusty despite the early hour. "Morning, everyone. Alan, Tom, I've got news that you're going to want to hear. The preliminary numbers for our first full season are in." "And?" Tom asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer was good. "Total revenue from all sources, pumpkin patch, corn maze, hay rides, farm store, educational tours, and private events, is just over $230,000. Alan nearly choked on his coffee. They'd projected maybe half that amount for their first year. 230,000 in 6 months? Actually, that's from April through September. October isn't finished yet, and it's looking like our biggest month ever. We've got bookings for school groups, corporate retreats, and private parties straight through Thanksgiving." Tom Henderson sat down heavily on the farmhouse steps, looking stunned. "That's more than I ever made in a year from traditional farming." "And that's just the beginning," Linda continued, her excitement evident. "The wedding venue we're planning for next spring is already booked for 6 events, at an average of $8,000 per event. The fishing operation won't be fully operational until next year, but we've already got advance bookings for corporate fishing retreats." "Don't forget the music events," Martha added. "Those 3 songwriter evenings we hosted in September brought in $12,000 and generated more publicity than we could have bought with advertising." Alan felt a familiar surge of pride, but also something deeper, a sense of having participated in something truly meaningful. "What about the traditional farming operation? How are the crops doing?" Marcus Williams chose that moment to arrive, driving up in his dusty Jeep with a load of pumpkins in the back. Over the months, he'd become not just their agricultural consultant, but a full partner in the operation's success. "Perfect timing," he called out as he climbed out of the vehicle. "I was just meeting with the organic certification inspector. We should have our official organic designation by next spring, which means we can charge premium prices for our produce." "And," he continued, pulling out his phone to check his notes, "I've got 3 restaurants in Atlanta that want to contract for our organic vegetables next year. Farm-to-table dining is huge right now, and having Alan Jackson's name associated with the produce doesn't hurt." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A black BMW pulled into the parking area, and a woman in business attire stepped out, looking somewhat out of place among the families dressed for a day at the farm. "Mr. Jackson, Mr. Henderson, I'm Rebecca Thompson from the Governor's Office of Rural Development. I was hoping we could have a few minutes to discuss something rather significant." 20 minutes later, they were gathered around the kitchen table in the Henderson farmhouse, with Rebecca Thompson explaining an opportunity that none of them had anticipated. "The governor has been following your success here very closely," she began, "and he's convinced that this model could be transformative for rural Georgia. He wants to propose legislation that would create tax incentives for similar partnerships statewide." "What kind of tax incentives?" Alan asked. "Significant ones. Investors who partner with family farms for agricultural diversification would be eligible for substantial tax credits. Family farms that participate would get property tax relief and access to low-interest development loans. The goal is to replicate what you've done here across the state." Tom Henderson looked around the table. "You're talking about making this official government policy?" "That's exactly what I'm talking about. The Henderson Farm model could become the template for rural development throughout Georgia and potentially other states." Alan felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. What had started as a simple act of helping a neighbor was now being discussed as a potential model for state policy. "Rebecca, what would this mean for us specifically?" "Well, you'd be asked to serve as advisors for the program, help evaluate other potential partnerships, share your experiences with new participants, maybe testify before the state legislature about why this approach works." "And the downside?" Tom asked. At 71, he'd learned to be cautious about anything that sounded too good to be true. "The downside is that you'd lose some of your privacy. You'd become the poster family for this program, which means even more media attention, more visitors, more scrutiny of everything you do." Martha Henderson spoke up for the first time. "Tom, what do you think?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at the bustling farm operation that had replaced his nearly failed traditional farming business. "I keep thinking about something," he said finally. "When we were about to lose this place, our neighbors showed up. Not just to say goodbye, but to fight for us. And Alan here, he didn't just write a check and walk away. He became a real partner, learned about farming, worked alongside us." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Now we've got the chance to maybe help other farming families avoid what we went through. Maybe help other folks like Alan find ways to invest in their communities that really matter. Seems to me that if we've got knowledge and experience that could help other people, we ought to share it." Rebecca Thompson smiled. "So you're interested?" Tom looked at Alan, who nodded slowly. "We're interested, but we want to do this right. No shortcuts, no quick fixes. If we're going to put our names on this, it needs to be something that really works for the families involved." "That's exactly why the governor wants you involved. You've proven that this can work, but you've also maintained the integrity of traditional farming while adapting to modern economic realities." As Rebecca Thompson left with commitments from both Alan and Tom to participate in the state program, the partners stood on the farmhouse porch, watching the afternoon crowd enjoy the fruits of their collaboration. Children ran through the corn maze while parents browsed the farm store, filled with pumpkins, apple cider, and homemade preserves that Martha Henderson had learned to make from vegetables grown on their own land. "Alan," Tom said quietly, "I need to thank you for something." "Tom, you've thanked me plenty." "No, not for the money, for treating me like a real partner. You could have just bought this place and hired me to work it. But you didn't. You made me a partner, respected what I knew about farming, let me be part of all the decisions. That meant more to me than the financial help." Alan felt something tighten in his throat. "Tom, I learned more about business from you in 6 months than I learned in 20 years in the music industry. You taught me what real partnership means." As the sun set over Henderson Farms, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Alan Jackson realized that he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. The satisfaction of creating something meaningful with his own hands, the deep fulfillment of helping preserve a way of life that mattered, and the joy of being part of a community in a way that went beyond celebrity or entertainment. The Henderson farm had been saved. But more than that, it had become a symbol of what was possible when people came together around shared values and mutual respect. The success had attracted national attention, inspired state policy, and created a model that was being replicated across the country. But perhaps most importantly, it had proven that the values Alan Jackson had spent his career singing about, hard work, community, taking care of your neighbors, weren't just lyrics to a song. They were principles that could guide real action and create real change in the world. As the last visitors of the day made their way to their cars, arms full of pumpkins and hearts full of memories, Tom Henderson and Alan Jackson stood side by side on the porch of the old farmhouse, partners in an enterprise that had grown far beyond anything either of them had imagined. The harvest had been more abundant than they dared to hope, not just in pumpkins and corn, but in hope itself. Hope for rural communities, hope for family farms, and hope for the possibility that success in America could still be measured in more than just money. The Henderson farm would open again tomorrow, and the day after that, and for many years to come. But tonight, as the Georgia stars appeared in the clear autumn sky, it was enough to stand on the porch of a saved farm and know that they'd created something that would outlast them both. In the distance, they could hear the sound of families laughing as they made their way home, carrying with them a little piece of rural America and the story of what happened when a country music star and a farmer decided that some things were worth fighting for. The harvest was complete, and it was good. The end. This story is a work of fiction. While inspired by real issues facing family farms across America, all characters and events are fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Familiar fire building in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had when he'd written Little Bitty or Gone Country, a mixture of indignation and inspiration that usually preceded his best work. But this wasn't about music. This was about something much more fundamental. "Mr. Henderson, would you mind if I asked you to wait here for just a little while? I need to make a phone call." Tom looked puzzled. "I suppose. Not like we got anywhere else to be." Alan walked back to his truck, his mind racing. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Frank, it's Alan. I need you to get me in touch with First National Bank of Macon right now. And Frank, clear my schedule for the rest of the week." As he ended the call, Alan looked back at Tom and Martha Henderson, still sitting by their truck, surrounded by their neighbors and their grief. Something was crystallizing in his mind, a plan that was part impulse and part calculation, but mostly heart. He'd spent his career singing about the America that these people represented. The farmers and factory workers, the small-town dreamers, and the big-hearted neighbors who showed up when things got tough. Now he had a chance to do more than just sing about it. Alan Jackson had made a decision that would change not just the Hendersons' lives, but his own understanding of what it truly meant to use the platform he'd been given. The Georgia heat continued to shimmer off the asphalt, but for the first time that day, Tom Henderson looked up from his hands and watched the country music star pacing beside his pickup truck, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing with the kind of intensity that suggested something significant was about to happen. The phone call that shook the bank. 20 minutes later, Alan Jackson was still on the phone, but his pacing had become more purposeful. He'd worked his way through 3 different bank representatives, each one passing him up the chain of command with increasing nervousness. The crowd around the Hendersons had grown larger as word spread through the small community that a famous singer was somehow getting involved in their neighbor's crisis. Tom Henderson had stopped crying and was watching Alan with a mixture of hope and skepticism. He'd lived long enough to know that when celebrities got involved in regular folks' problems, it often created more complications than solutions. But there was something different about the intensity with which Alan was approaching this situation. "Yes, sir, I understand you're busy," Alan was saying into the phone, his voice carrying the polite but firm tone of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "But I'm standing here with Mr. Tom Henderson, and I'm looking at a situation that I think we need to resolve today. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today." Martha Henderson approached Alan cautiously. "Mr. Jackson, you don't need to—" He held up a finger and smiled at her, but continued speaking into the phone. "Mr. Williams, let me be clear about something. I've been banking with your institution for 15 years. My business manager handles millions of dollars through your bank every year. Now I'm asking you, as a customer and as someone who cares about this community, to give me 30 minutes of your time to discuss Tom Henderson's situation." There was a pause, and Alan's expression shifted slightly. "That's right. Alan Jackson, the one who sings Chattahoochee." He winked at Martha, who despite everything cracked a small smile. "Now, Mr. Williams, I'm going to drive to your office, and I'm bringing Mr. Henderson with me. We're going to sit down like civilized people and figure out a solution to this problem." Another pause. "No, sir, I don't think you understand. This isn't a request. I'll be there in 45 minutes. You can either meet with us, or you can explain to your board of directors why you turned away one of your biggest customers over a $200,000 loan." Alan ended the call and turned to face the gathered crowd. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Tom Henderson slowly stood up from his tailgate. "Son," Tom said quietly, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but banks don't work that way. They've made their decision. Mr. Henderson, with respect, you don't know how banks work. When Alan Jackson walks into their lobby asking questions." Alan's voice carried a confidence born from years of navigating the business side of the music industry. "The thing about money is that it talks, and right now, I've got their attention." He looked around at the assembled neighbors and friends. "How many of y'all bank at First National?" About half the crowd raised their hands. "And how many of y'all think what's happening to the Hendersons is right?" Not a single hand stayed down. Alan nodded slowly. "Then we're all going to take a little trip to Macon, because I've got a feeling that Mr. Williams might be more interested in finding a solution when he sees that this isn't just about one family. It's about an entire community." An hour later, the parking lot of First National Bank of Macon looked like the staging area for a small-town festival. 15 pickup trucks, 3 SUVs, and Alan's black Suburban had formed an impromptu convoy that had drawn stares and whispers from other bank customers. Alan had called ahead to warn them, but seeing the actual crowd was clearly more intimidating than Bank President Charles Williams had anticipated. Williams met them in the lobby, a nervous man in his 50s wearing a suit that probably cost more than most of the farmers in the group made in a month. His handshake was firm but sweaty when he greeted Alan. "Mr. Jackson, This is quite a gathering you've brought with you. These are the Hendersons' neighbors, Mr. Williams. Folks who've been customers of this bank for decades. They wanted to come show their support. Williams looked around at the group, clearly calculating the potential public relations nightmare he was facing. Perhaps we should discuss this in my office. I think the conference room might be more appropriate, Alan suggested smoothly. This concerns the whole community. 10 minutes later, they were seated around a polished mahogany table that had probably hosted thousands of loan meetings over the years, but never one quite like this. Tom and Martha Henderson sat on either side of Alan, while several of their neighbors filled the remaining chairs. Charles Williams sat across from them with two other bank officials who'd been hastily summoned to deal with the situation. "Now then," Williams began, shuffling through a thick folder, "Mr. Henderson's account. I've reviewed the file, and I'm afraid the situation is quite clear. The loan is 90 days past due, and according to our agreements—" "Mr. Williams," Alan interrupted gently, "before we talk about agreements and legal obligations, let me ask you something. How long has Mr. Henderson been a customer of this bank?" Williams consulted his papers. 34 years. "And in those 34 years, how many times has he been late on a payment?" "Well, there have been a few instances." "How many times, Mr. Williams?" Williams looked uncomfortable. 3 times, including the current situation. "So, in 34 years, Tom Henderson has been late exactly 3 times. Would you say that makes him a good customer?" "Mr. Jackson, I understand you're trying to help, but business is business. We have fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders." "Your shareholders?" Alan leaned back in his chair. "Let me tell you about shareholders, Mr. Williams. I am one. My business manager informed me this morning that my various accounts represent approximately $12 million in assets held by this bank. Now, I'm wondering if your shareholders might be interested in knowing that you're willing to risk losing that relationship over a $200,000 loan to a 34-year customer with an exemplary payment history." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Williams's face had gone slightly pale. "Furthermore," Alan continued, his voice still conversational but carrying an edge of steel, "I'm wondering if your shareholders might be interested in the story that's about to be told about how this bank foreclosed on a Gold Star family. That's a family that lost a son in military service, Mr. Williams, during a week when that family was already grieving and struggling." Martha Henderson reached over and squeezed Alan's arm. "Mr. Jackson, you don't need to—" "Mrs. Henderson, with respect, I do need to. Because this isn't just about your family, as much as I care about what happens to you and Tom. This is about what kind of community we want to live in. This is about whether we're going to let good people lose everything they've worked for over circumstances beyond their control, or whether we're going to find a way to help each other through the tough times." Tom Henderson spoke up for the first time since entering the bank. "Mr. Williams, I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for time. Give me another year and I'll pay every penny I owe you. I've got good crops coming in this fall, and my younger boy's been talking about coming back to help with the farm." Williams looked around the table, clearly torn between business protocol and the very real pressure he was facing. "Mr. Henderson, even if I wanted to restructure your loan, which would be highly irregular, the amount you're behind is substantial. We'd need some kind of guarantee, some assurance that you could meet the modified terms." Alan reached into his jacket and pulled out his checkbook. "How much does he need to bring the loan current?" "Approximately $78,000. Without hesitation, Alan began writing. The scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room. When he finished, he tore the check from the book and slid it across the table to Williams. "There. The loan is current. Now let's talk about restructuring the remaining balance over a reasonable time frame." Williams stared at the check as if it were radioactive. "Mr. Jackson, I can't accept this. Bank regulations. The check isn't to the bank, Mr. Williams. It's to Tom Henderson. What Mr. Henderson does with that money is his business. If he chooses to pay down his loan, that's his decision. Tom Henderson was staring at Alan with tears streaming down his face. Son, I can't let you do this. This is too much. Mr. Henderson, let me tell you a story. Alan's voice had softened, but his eyes remained fixed on the bank president. My granddaddy was a sharecropper in Georgia. Worked land that wasn't his for most of his life, dreaming of the day he could own something of his own. He never got that chance, died working somebody else's fields. He paused, looking around the room. My daddy managed to buy a small place, nothing fancy, but it was ours. Taught me the value of owning the land you work, of being able to pass something on to your children. Now, I've been blessed beyond anything my granddaddy could have imagined. I've made more money than I ever dreamed of making. But all of that success, all of that good fortune, it's built on the foundation that men like you laid, Mr. Henderson. Men who worked the land and raised families and sacrificed for something bigger than themselves. Alan turned back to Williams. So, Mr. Williams, here's what's going to happen. You're going to accept Mr. Henderson's payment and bring his loan current. Then you're going to work with him to restructure the remaining balance over a term that makes sense for a 70-year-old farmer who's been a faithful customer for 34 years. And if you're not willing to do that, then I'm going to walk out of here and make some phone calls to people who might be very interested in this story. Williams looked at his colleagues, then back at the check on the table. Mr. Jackson, assuming we were to proceed with this arrangement, what assurance do we have that Mr. Henderson can meet the restructured terms? Before Alan could answer, one of the neighbors who had remained silent throughout the meeting spoke up. Mr. Williams, my name is Robert Chen. I own the largest equipment dealership in 3 counties. Tom Henderson has been buying equipment from me for 20 years, and he's never missed a payment. Not once. Another neighbor chimed in. I'm Sarah Mitchell. My family owns Mitchell Feed and Supply. The Hendersons have been customers since before I was born. Never bounced a check, never been late on their account. One by one, the neighbors around the table began speaking up, each one vouching for Tom Henderson's character and reliability. Williams found himself facing not just one famous customer, but an entire community of people who clearly intended to hold him accountable for his decision. Mr. Williams, Alan said finally, I think you can see that Tom Henderson isn't just asking for help from strangers. He's got a whole community behind him. People who know his character and his work ethic, people who believe in him enough to take time out of their day to come sit in this conference room and advocate for him. Williams picked up the check and studied it for a long moment. $78,000, written in Alan Jackson's distinctive handwriting. Made out to Tom Henderson, not the bank, which meant that technically there was nothing irregular about accepting it once Henderson endorsed it over. Mr. Henderson, Williams said finally, assuming you want to proceed with this payment, I'm prepared to offer you a restructured loan for the remaining balance. $152,000 over 15 years at our current agricultural rate. Tom Henderson looked at his wife, then at Alan, then at the neighbors who had come to support him. That would make my payments approximately $900 a month, Williams calculated quickly. Tom nodded slowly. I can manage $900 a month. Then we have an agreement. Williams extended his hand across the table. As Tom Henderson shook hands with the bank president, Alan felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with music or fame or any of the things that usually defined his professional life. This was different. This was about using the platform he'd been given to make a real difference in real people's lives. But even as he watched the relief and gratitude on the Hendersons' faces, Alan was already thinking about what came next. Because writing a check, while necessary, was only the beginning of what this family needed. They still had a farm to run, crops to harvest, and a future to rebuild. And Alan Jackson had just committed himself to being part of that future in ways he was only beginning to understand. The plan that nobody saw coming. 2 days after the meeting at the bank, Alan Jackson was back on the Henderson farm, but this time he wasn't alone. His pickup truck was followed by 3 other vehicles, including a dusty Jeep belonging to Marcus Williams, an agricultural consultant from the University of Georgia, and a newer Toyota truck driven by Linda Patterson, a rural development specialist with 20 years of experience helping small farms transition to sustainable operations. Tom Henderson met them at the farmhouse, still somewhat bewildered by the rapid turn his life had taken. The past 48 hours had been a whirlwind of phone calls, paperwork, and neighbors stopping by to congratulate him on what the local paper had already dubbed the miracle on Highway 341. But Alan could see the worry still etched in the older man's face. "Tom," Alan said, climbing out of his truck, "I want you to meet some folks who are going to help us figure out the best way forward." "Us?" Tom asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, I figure if I'm invested in this operation now, I should probably take an interest in how it's run." Alan grinned and gestured toward the experts he'd brought with him. "But don't worry, I'm not planning to trade my guitar for a plow anytime soon." Marcus Williams, no relation to the bank president, was a lean man in his 40s with dirt permanently embedded under his fingernails and the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. He shook Tom's hand with the firm grip of someone who understood the value of physical labor. "Mr. Henderson, I've been looking over your property records and soil surveys. You've got some excellent land here. The question is how to maximize its potential given your current situation." Linda Patterson stepped forward, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Henderson, I specialize in helping family farms develop multiple revenue streams. Alan called me because he thought you might be interested in exploring some options beyond traditional row crops." Martha Henderson appeared on the front porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Y'all come up on the porch and sit a spell. I've got fresh lemonade, and it's getting hot out here." 20 minutes later, they were seated in a circle on the covered porch, glasses of lemonade sweating in the morning heat, while Marcus Williams spread out maps and soil surveys on a small table. "Here's what I see," Marcus began, pointing to different sections of the farm. "You've got about 60 acres of prime bottomland here along the creek. That's some of the best soil in the county. Then you've got 120 acres of upland that's good for corn and soybeans, and about 60 acres of pasture land that's not being used to its full potential." Tom nodded. "Been thinking about getting some cattle again. Had a small herd years ago, but it got to be too much work when the boys left home." "Cattle might be one option," Linda said, "but there are others we should consider. Have you ever thought about agritourism?" Martha laughed. "What's agritourism? Sounds like something folks in Atlanta would make up." "Actually, it's a growing industry," Linda explained. "People from urban areas paying to experience farm life. Everything from corn mazes in the fall to pick-your-own vegetables, farm-to-table dinners, even wedding venues. You'd be surprised how much city folks will pay to spend a day on a working farm." Alan leaned forward, interested. "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" "Well, a successful corn maze can generate $15,000 to $20,000 in a 6-week period during October and November. Pick-your-own operations, depending on what you're growing, can bring in anywhere from $5 to $50 per family per visit." "Wedding venues." Linda paused, looking around at the scenic property. "A place like this, with the right setup, could host weddings for anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 per event." Tom was shaking his head. "I'm a farmer, not a event planner or whatever. I don't know nothing about entertaining city folks." "That's where community partnerships come in," Alan said. "Tom, you know this land better than anyone. You know how to grow crops and manage livestock, but you don't have to become a wedding planner overnight. There are people who specialize in that side of the business." Martha looked intrigued. "What kind of people?" "Well," Alan said, a plan beginning to form in his mind, "I happen to know a few folks in the entertainment business who might be interested in having a beautiful venue for events. And I know some people in Atlanta who are always looking for authentic farm experiences for their families." Marcus Williams pulled out another map. "Let me show you something else. This creek that runs along your property line, it's perfect for a fishing operation. Stock it with bass and catfish, build some simple platforms for fishing, and you could charge $25 a day per person. Not huge money, but steady income with minimal overhead." "And here's another thought," Linda added. "That's 60 acres of pasture land. Instead of cattle, what if you considered something like a pumpkin patch? October is peak agritourism season. Combine a pumpkin patch with a corn maze, maybe some hay rides, and you could have families coming from a 100-mile radius." Alan was scribbling notes on a napkin. "What about the music angle?" Everyone looked at him. "I mean, what if we had music events here? Not big concerts, but smaller, intimate shows, singer-songwriter nights, bluegrass festivals, that sort of thing. People love the idea of hearing music in a natural setting." Tom looked skeptical. "Alan, I appreciate all these ideas, but this sounds like more work than I can handle. I'm 70 years old." "Which is why you're not going to handle it alone," Alan replied. "Tom, what if I told you I was thinking about investing in this operation as a business partner? Not just the loan payment, but as an actual partner in developing these new revenue streams." The porch fell silent, except for the sound of cicadas in the nearby trees. "What are you saying?" Martha asked quietly. "I'm saying that maybe this farm could become something special. Something that honors the traditional farming that Tom's family has done for generations, but also provides new opportunities for income and growth. A place where people can come to understand what rural life is really about, while also ensuring that the Henderson family has a secure financial future." Marcus Williams looked up from his maps. "It could work. I've seen similar operations succeed in other parts of Georgia. The key is starting with 1 or 2 initiatives and building from there." Linda nodded in agreement. "And the timing is perfect. There's growing interest in farm tourism, especially after the pandemic. People want to get out of the cities, experience nature, understand where their food comes from." Alan stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the farmland that stretched toward the horizon. "Tom, what if we started small? This fall, we set up a simple pumpkin patch and corn maze. Nothing fancy, just something to test the waters. Meanwhile, Marcus helps you optimize your traditional crops, maybe transition some of the land to more profitable vegetables or specialty crops. And next spring," Linda continued, "we could add the fishing operation and maybe a small vegetable garden where people can come pick their own tomatoes, corn, beans, whatever you want to grow." Tom looked at his wife, and Alan could see a silent conversation passing between them. "What kind of partnership are you talking about?" Tom asked finally. 50-50, Alan said without hesitation. "You provide the land and the farming expertise. I provide the capital investment and the marketing know-how. We split the profits equally, but more importantly, the land stays in your family. This is your farm, Tom. I'm just helping you develop its potential." Martha leaned forward in her chair. "Alan, why are you doing this? I mean, really, you could invest your money in anything. Why a farm in Middle Georgia?" Alan was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Mrs. Henderson, I've spent my whole career singing about people like you and Tom. The backbone of America, the folks who work hard and play by the rules and take care of their families and their communities. But somewhere along the way, I realized that singing about something and actually doing something are two different things. He turned to face the group. I've been blessed with success that goes beyond anything I ever imagined. But that success is built on the foundation of the values that people like you represent. Hard work, honesty, taking care of your neighbors. It seems to me that if I really believe in those values, I should put my money where my mouth is. Tom Henderson stood up slowly and walked over to where Alan was standing. He extended his weathered hand. "Partner," he said simply. As they shook hands, Alan felt something click into place. This wasn't just about saving a farm or helping a family. Though those things mattered enormously, this was about creating something new, something that could serve as a model for how rural communities could adapt and thrive in a changing economy. "So," Marcus Williams said, gathering up his maps, "when do we start?" "Right now," Alan replied. "Linda, can you help us identify the best location for a pumpkin patch and corn maze?" "Marcus, I want to understand exactly what crops will give us the best return on investment." "Tom, I want you to think about which of your neighbors might be interested in providing services. Hay rides, maybe some craft demonstrations, that sort of thing." Martha Henderson smiled for the first time since Alan had known her. "This is really going to happen, isn't it?" "Mrs. Henderson," Alan said, grinning back at her, "you ain't seen nothing yet." As the group began making concrete plans for the transformation of the Henderson farm, none of them could have anticipated the media attention that was about to descend upon their quiet corner of Georgia, or the way their partnership would inspire similar efforts across rural America. They were simply four people and a country music star, sitting on a farmhouse porch, dreaming about pumpkins and corn mazes and the possibility of preserving a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. But sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with the most ordinary conversations, and what was happening on the Henderson farm was about to become much larger than any of them imagined. When dreams become headlines. 3 weeks later, Alan Jackson stood in what used to be Tom Henderson's back 40, surveying the controlled chaos that had erupted around him. What had started as a simple conversation about pumpkins and corn mazes had evolved into something resembling a small-scale agricultural revolution. The local newspaper had gotten wind of the story first, running a front-page article titled "Country Star Partners with Local Farmer." But when the Atlanta Journal-Constitution picked up the story, and then CNN's rural affairs correspondent decided it was worth a segment, the quiet transformation of the Henderson farm suddenly became a national news story. Now, on this humid September morning, Alan found himself standing next to Tom Henderson, watching a crew from Good Morning America set up their equipment next to the newly planted pumpkin patch. "Tom," Alan said, adjusting his baseball cap against the morning sun, "when we shook hands on this deal, did you ever imagine we'd have network television crews tramping through your corn?" Tom chuckled, but Alan could see the nervousness in the older man's eyes. "Son, a month ago I was about to lose this place. Now I've got reporters calling me wanting to know about innovative rural development strategies. I don't even know what half those words mean." Marcus Williams approached them, clipboard in hand and dirt on his boots. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd become something of a project manager for the Henderson farm transformation, coordinating with contractors, agricultural suppliers, and now media crews. "Alan, Tom, the producer, wants to do the interview in about 20 minutes. They want to start with Tom talking about almost losing the farm, then move to you, explaining why you got involved, and finish with both of you walking through the new developments." "What new developments?" asked Linda Patterson, who had just arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a satisfied smile. "You mean like the fact that we've had 12 other farmers call this week asking about implementing similar programs?" or the fact that the University of Georgia wants to use this as a case study for their agricultural extension program. Alan accepted one of the coffee cups gratefully. 12 farmers? As of this morning, spread across 4 counties. Apparently word is getting around that there might be alternatives to losing the family farm. Linda's eyes were bright with excitement. Alan, I think you started something bigger than you realized. Before Alan could respond, Martha Henderson appeared from the direction of the farmhouse, walking briskly and looking slightly frazzled. Alan, honey, I hate to bother you, but there's a man here from some magazine in Nashville, and he's asking about doing a story on how this whole thing might influence your music. Plus, there's someone from the state agriculture department who wants to talk about making this an official pilot program for rural development. Alan felt a